The Great Depression is a defining period of American history and literature in the 1930s. This discussion draws on three sources: the Encyclopedia Britannica's entry on the Great Depression, Leslie Bow and Russ Castronovo's Oxford Handbook of 20th-Century American Literature, and Cavel Austin's thesis, The Representation of Poverty in Great Depression American Literature. These sources will help us understand the Depression as both an economic catastrophe and a literary movement. The Depression shattered illusions of prosperity and stability, throwing millions into poverty, unemployment, and despair. Writers responded with works that depicted suffering but also resilience, capturing the voice of the marginalized and reshaping American literature into a vehicle of social critique. By looking at how these texts frame this period, we will see how literature of the 1930s both documented hardship and sought to inspire change, giving voice to those who had been silenced. This cover image is the iconic Grant Wood's American Gothic, whose stark portrayal of rural life has become an emblem of the resilience and anxieties of the Depression era. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines the Great Depression as the most severe economic downturn of the 20th century, lasting from 1929 until the start of World War II. In the United States, unemployment reached nearly 25%, with millions of families losing their homes, savings, and livelihoods. Farms failed, industries collapsed, and banks closed. The crisis spread globally, but its effects were especially severe in the US, where the contrast with the booming 1920s made the fall all the more shocking. Beyond numbers, the human cost was immense. Poverty, hunger, migration, and despair shaped daily life. Families traveled in search of work, people lined up for bread, and communities were destabilized. This historical context is crucial. It is the backdrop against which American writers of the 1930s crafted their works. The Depression was not only an economic event, it was a cultural trauma that demanded literary response. Margaret Bourke-White's Fort Peck Dam, the photograph shown here, represents both the devastation and the massive public works, the projects that defined the Depression era. Bow and Castronovo emphasize that the Great Depression transformed literature into a tool of social documentation and critique. Writers responded directly to crisis, producing works that recorded hardship and advocated for change. The Federal Writers Project, part of the New Deal, employed thousands of writers to document the voices of ordinary people, sharecroppers, migrants, laborers, preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. At the same time, a new wave of proletarian literature emerged, focused on class struggles, workers' rights, and collective action. The South and Midwest became symbolic landscapes. Droughts, dust storms, and failing farms became metaphors for national despair. Bow and Castronovo show how literature shifted from individualist concern to collective ones, foregrounding poverty, labor, and injustice. For them, Depression-era literature represents a reorientation of American writing toward the political and the social, linking aesthetics with activism. This WPA poster, Work Pays America, illustrates how literature and culture were tied to New Deal efforts like the Federal Writers Project, which Bow and Castronovo highlight. Cavel Austin highlights how literature of the Depression represented poverty not as personal weakness, but as structural injustice. Stories, novels, and poems depicted hunger, eviction, and migration in ways that foregrounded the human cost of economic collapse. Literature gave voice to the marginalized, the poor, the rural, and the unemployed, who were often invisible in mainstream accounts. Austin argues that this representation was both empathetic and critical. Empathetic in showing the resilience of individuals and family, critical in exposing the systems that produced their suffering. Works of this era emphasize that poverty was not caused by laziness or failure, but by systemic economic breakdown. Literature became a moral act. To write about poverty was to demand recognition of shared humanity and to critique the structures of inequality. In this way, the Depression gave American literature a new role as a platform for empathy and social justice. Arthur Rothstein's Dust Storm, shown here, parallels Austin's point. poverty, and displacement were systemic realities, vividly captured in both literature and photography. Bao and Austin together identify the central themes of Depression-era literature. Poverty and migration dominate. Works often depict families uprooted, traveling in search of work, confronting humiliation and hardship. Displacement becomes both a literal and symbolic theme. Characters are not only geographically dislocated, but also socially marginalized. A tension emerges between collective struggle and individual survival. Some texts stress solidarity and labor movements, while others highlight isolation and endurance. The landscape is a powerful metaphor. Dust storms, droughts, and failing farms symbolize both environmental disaster and social collapse. Yet even amidst despair, resilience appears. Austen stresses that literature often portrays characters' dignity, humor, or endurance despite suffering. Bao emphasizes that this resilience offered a form of hope, showing that literature could inspire as well as document. Depression-era literature thus balanced bleak realism with moments of affirmation, revealing both the depth of loss and the persistence of human strength. Edward Hooper's gas, shown here, echoes themes of isolation and displacement, showing ordinary spaces as metaphors for uncertainty and survival. Bao's article underscores the cultural and political dimensions of Depression-era writing. Many writers aligned with leftist politics, producing proletarian novels that dramatized strikes, labor struggles, and collective action. Literature became a site of debate. Could art remain aesthetically autonomous in a time of crisis, or must it serve as propaganda for social change? Some argued that the political urgency of the Depression required art to be socially responsible, to mobilize empathy and action. Others feared that literature reduced to propaganda could lose its complexity and artistry. This tension shaped the period. Novels like The Grapes of Wrath were praised for balancing social critique with rich storytelling, while others were critiqued as too didactic. For Bao, this debate reveals the stakes of the 1930s. Literature was inseparable from politics, and the Depression forced writers to grapple with the relationship between art and social responsibility. Evergood painting shown here, American Tragedy, captures Bao's point about proletarian culture, dramatizing labor struggle and class conflict in Depression-era art. Austen emphasizes that the greatest achievement of Depression literature was its capacity to foster empathy. By centering stories of the poor, literature resisted the stigma that often attached to poverty. It showed characters not as failures, but as people with dignity, aspirations, and humanity. Literature elevated ordinary voices into cultural memory. The voices of farmers, sharecroppers, migrant workers, and the unemployed were inscribed into the national narrative. This act of representation was itself political. It challenged stereotypes, demanded recognition, and humanized the statistics of unemployment and hunger. Austen insists that empathy was not sentimental but transformative. It required readers to acknowledge systemic injustice and to see the poor as central to America's story. In this way, Depression literature became a humanizing force, expanding the boundaries of what American literature could include and whom it could represent. Elizabeth Catlett's painting here, Sharecropper, visually extend Austen's argument that literature and art elevated ordinary, marginalized voices or faces into cultural memory. Taken together, our three sources highlight the broader significance of Depression literature. It marked a decisive shift from individualist concerns to collective identity. Writers no longer focus primarily on elite or middle class experiences, but on the lives of workers, migrants, and the poor. Literature became a historical witness, documenting the crisis in real time and preserving the voices of those who endured it. Poverty and resilience emerged as central themes, shaping the imagination of the era. In doing so, the Depression expanded the American literary canon, forcing recognition that the stories of the marginalized mattered, that literature could not ignore the voices of the poor. This reorientation made literature both socially urgent and artistically innovative. For these critics, the 1930s stand as proof that literature can serve as witness, critique, and inspiration during moments of national crisis. Saturday Night, the painting shown here, illustrates resilience amidst hardship, reminding us that Depression-era culture also persevered joy and community. In conclusion, the Great Depression was both an economic catastrophe and a cultural transformation. Literature responded by depicting crisis with realism, empathy, and critique. Writers captured poverty, migration, and displacement, but also resilience and dignity. They turned literature into a collective voice, giving representation to those who have been marginalized or forgotten. The Britannica provides the historical background, Bow's article emphasizes the political and cultural dimensions, and Austin highlights the representation of poverty and empathy. These sources show that the Great Depression redefined American literature, expanding its scope to include new voices and new responsibilities. Its legacy endures. Literature is remembered not only for its artistry, but also for its capacity to bear witness, to humanize, and to demand recognition of suffering. Depression-era writing reminds us that literature can be a form of survival, a testament to resilience, and a call for justice. These writers shown here, Steinbeck, Wright, Olson, and Lusser, emphasized how Depression-era literature broadened the canon by centering marginalized voices.